Hi, welcome back. We are going to be talking now a little bit about why it's that popularity is so important. How come this is something that is affecting us so much when we are young, and how come it's something we seem to kind of gravitate towards for the rest of our lives? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. One thing I'm going to point out is that idea that is has become really explicit. Have you even noticed recently if you are not on the web? There is a lot of information about what's trending. Whether you are on Twitter or whether you are just even looking at a news story or anything you see, you will sometimes see these graphics that talk about how many times has a story been tweeted, or how many people have liked it on Facebook, or how many comments are there, and often that's right at the top of the story. In fact, even after you are done reading the story, there is maybe those icons again. Encouraging you should tweet about it, you should like it on Facebook. Why is that happening? We have kind of almost grown accustomed to it. I think one of the reasons why there is happening is it's based on this fundamental premise that if we see that a lot of people are really interested in something, we will think how somehow it's good or it's important. We want to do what everyone else is doing, even if we resist that idea and we think, no, I'm an individual, I don't just conform. Still, we are kind of a bit influenced by that. We think, well, if that's something that 300 other people have liked, then it must be something really important that I need to look at. It's the same thing when you watch a commercial and they say this is the number one movie at the box office. They are really trying to pull on the idea that's still popular and therefore that means it's good. But why does that work so well? Why do we even care about the fact that everyone else is doing it? I mean, I want to read the news stories that I think are of interest to me, and I don't think my interests are going to be the same as 10,000 other people that read the same news story. So why would I automatically think that is so important? It turns out that a lot of this might have to do with the way that we development as a species. And the way that we can think about that is we took a step way back and thought about this from an evolutionary perspective. So let's go back to the world of cavemen and cave women, and really thought about that life was like at that time because that's how we developed the brains we have today. Even thought that's a long time ago. That's not very long ago from the perspective of our biological development. So there are lots of ways that what happened back then is still influencing us today and it's still influencing how our brains work. So have you even noticed how if you roam then other people around you will yum? Yums are kinds of contagious. Or have you ever heard that when women live together in a close quarters or spend a lot of time together, their menstrual cycles will start to synchronize? That all has to do with the same idea here. It's the sense that when we were cave people a long time ago, we quickly learned that we are going to do a lot of better if we live together. And if we kind of pay attention to signals from each other. So if you think about it, if you went on your own well, you would have a hard time getting food, right? And if you got food and you killed something like a giant wild beast or whatever, you're not going to be able to eat all of that all by yourself. So it's inefficient. And if you try to save the rest of it, it's going to spoil and you are going to get sick and die. And evolutionary, you are going to be weeded out. So we really learn that when it comes to food, same with safety, protecting one another, or when it comes to other ways of coordinating activities, like when should we all go to sleep, and that way we can all go to the next part of our nomadic rope, so that helps us to get the next part of where we are trying to move to. It would be good if that was all synchronized and we were in a herd and we learn to be a herd. And the more you stay in a herd, the more you sleep when everyone sleeps. That way we can all work together and move together at the same time. The more that everyone stops to give birth or to convince new babies, that should all happen at the same time. We should all eat together. We should all protect each other. If you are living the herd, then those things will be threatened. You won't get food, you won't be safe, you won't stop at the same times as other, and you might be kicked out. You might be alone, you might be unsafe, and that is not good for you. The people that didn't that they were weeded out through natural selection. We are all the people that survived by learning to pay attention to what we heard has to say. It turns out that has had a really cool individual effect on how our brains are put together. But we just recently discovered this in ways that we kind of didn't even expect. So there have been a lot of researchers that have been interested in understanding how the brain works. And in particular, there have been a lot of people that have looked at how the brain kind of lights up in a fMRI, let's say, when we experiences pain. So what I mean but by that is there have been a lot of studies where they have asked people to lay down in a fMRIs that are kind of lying there, and they show them a screen over their head, and they give them an opportunity so experience some types of stimuli. Now, in some cases, those might be real life stimuli. So, while the hand is sticking out of the fMRI, they might get a little prick or some sort of the painful stimulus. And when that happens, the fMRI would allow them to see what areas of the brain are kind of lighting up. And what we learned was very reliable. For a very long time, we have seen in research that there are particularly areas that tells us that there are experiencing pain, and the areas that tell us it's time to start regulating this pain and doing something about it. Now the parts of our brain that signal pain is really important because the pain is our ways off. It's the brain's way of telling us something very serious is happening, you need to do something about it. It is going to threaten your survival. So, pain is kind of the most powerful signal that our brains can give us to tell us that if we don't do something soon, we may die or our species may be in trouble. Well, an interesting thing happens. So there were some researchers, including Naomi Eisenberg from USLR, who decided to do some studies looking at people in the fMRI machine in the magnet. And they asked them to, instead of getting real pain, they asked them to participate in some interaction where they were getting included by other. And the way that this worked was sometimes there were real people that folks were communicating with while they were in the magnet, and sometimes they were just pretended. By and the way that this worked was sometimes there were real people that folks were communicating with while they were in a magnet, and sometimes they just pretend. But either way, the experiments put it together so the person in the fMRI magnet thought that they were being excluded and that others were choosing not to interact with them. So in a way, it was kind of like they were getting a signal saying you are getting kicked out of the herd. You are not part of the group anymore. You are getting excluded. It turns out they were very surprised to find that when people got this signal to say that they were getting excluded, the parts of their brain that lit up were the parts of the brain that light up when we experience real physical pain. And this kind of led to the idea that there might be something called social pain. We experience social exclusion in the exact same way that they experience physical pain. In fact, there are even research to say that if you take a Tylenol, then that helps your social pain go down, just like it helps your physical pain go down. So maybe this is why even the way that we see it in English, our language tends to mirror the idea of pain. We talk about heartbreak or homesickness. It's the idea that we experience physical symptoms from a social rejection experience. So it kind of suggests that there is some way that the lack of popularity makes us experience pain, and our brains is telling us with its most powerful signal, you need to do something about this. Don't get kicked out of the herd. Make sure that you are safe. It turns out that there's some other research also that has to do with our DNA that's found that is even more powerful than we even realized. But before we talk about it, I just have to tell you briefly about something that's really new, and it's the idea of epigenetics. Epigenetics is really the same that while we all have our DNA and every signal cell in our bodies, that DNA in its nucleus, that DNA, not every gene is turned on. But when we recently learned in epigenetic that sometimes what makes those cells turn on certain DNA is something that happens in our environment. So believe it or not, someone could walk in the room, they could say hello to you, or they could say something not pleasant to you that kind of rejects you, and that will actually affect what happens in your own cells. And the reason why this is important is because, as you probably know, many of our cells are dying every second, and new cells are grown every second. So, if an experience happens to you now, the cells that will start growing 2 seconds from you are going to start relying on the DNA that was activated by what happened to you before. In fact, it's been suggested that every 6 months or somewhere the person that is reactive to what happened to us and those prior cells about 6 months ago. So we are constantly renewed people that are living through epigenetics based on what happened to us month before. It turns out our social experiences have an incredible important impact on the DNA. So for the same reasons we talked about before with hearting and with our evolutionary legacy. We've learned that if something happens to us that makes us feel reject, then our bodies turn on specific DNA, and the DNA they turn on has to do with our physical health. So again, let's think again about cave people. If you were a person that was living back in those time, one of the things that happened when you lived with other is you found that you got a lot of colds. And the reason why is because viruses spread from human to human. As long as you are interacting with other people, your DNA is activated to develop immunity to viruses. And all of the genes that helps us to resist viruses are upregulating. In other words, they are kind of turned on. If you were part of the herd, there was much less of a chance that a dinosaur was going to come and eat your arm off. Therefore, you would have to have a lot of inflammatory types of responses in your body to heal that bleeding limb and keep you to survive. You wouldn't need that kind of pro-inflammatory protections as much. Well, what happens is the minute we get rejected by others, we actually find that the genes that help us resist viruses become down-regulated. In fact, you can take a blood test 40 minutes later and find that you can see the signs of that so quickly. Meanwhile, the inflammatory responses all up regulate. So, of course, if something happens to you for 1 minute today, that doesn't mean you're going to have an inflammatory disease necessary. But if you experience chronic rejection over so much time, you experience ways to feeling that you are not part of the herd, you are not someone that is accepted and popular, that over time your cells will continually develop this up-regulated inflammatory response. So it turns out that popularity is actually changing the way that our DNA expresses. So it turns out that popularity is actually changing the way that our DNA expresses. This has major implication for health. And it turns out that there is a way that has a feedback loop into our brains, and that even changes our mood and our experience too. And we'll talk about more of that later. So, in a summary, it's important to remember that one of the reasons why we seem to care so much about popularity is that our species thought about being in the herd as something we need for safety. And the minute that we lose popularity, our body is preparing us for what will happen when we were kicked out of the herd. And our brain is telling us with its most powerful signal, you are needing to do something to fix this. Go back to others, do what you can, and be part of the group. And that's really important. Our DNA is changing. This is all very adaptive, but unfortunately, it's not really helpful for us today in the millennium that we live in now. You can go out for a fun walk on your own and not get eaten by a dinosaur. So, unfortunately, your bodies are helping us in a way that would have been useful millions of years ago, but it's not necessarily helpful in today's society. And that's some of the reasons why popularity plays such a huge role today, but it has effects on us that aren't necessarily what we would have wished for.